remember the Catskill Mountains. They are a dismembered branch of the great Appalachian family and are seen away to the west of the river, swelling up to a noble night and lording it over the surrounding country. At the foot of these fairy mountains is a village of great antiquity, having been founded by some of the Dutch colonists in the early times of the province. In that same village there lived a simple fellow of the name Rip Van Winkle. I have observed that he was a simple, good-natured man. He was, moreover, a kind neighbor and an obedient, hen-pecked husband. The children of the village would shout with joy whenever he approached. Rip Van Winkle, however, was one of those happy mortals of foolish, well-willed dispositions who took the world easy, ate white bread or brown, whichever can be got with the least thought or trouble, and would rather starve on a penny than work for a pound. If left to himself, he would have whistled life away in perfect contentment. But his wife kept continually dinning in his ears about his idleness, his carelessness, and the ruin he was bringing on his family. Morning, noon, and night, her tongue was incessantly going, and everything he said or did was sure to produce a torrent of household eloquence. Rip had but one way of replying. He shrugged his shoulders, shook his head, cast up his eyes, but said nothing. This, however, always provoked a fresh volley from his wife, so that he was fain to draw off his forces and take to the outside of the house. Rip's sole domestic adherent was his dog Wolf, who was as much henpecked as his master, for Dame Van Winkle regarded them as companions of idleness, and even looked upon Wolf with an evil eye, and caused the stare of the master going astray. Times grew worse and worse with Rip Van Winkle as years of matrimony rolled on. A tart temper never mellows with age, and a sharp tongue is the only edged tool that grows keener with constant use. For a long while, he used to console himself when driven from home by a kind of perpetual club of the sages, philosophers, and other idle personages of the village. Here, they used to sit in the shade through a long, lazy summer's day, talking listlessly over village gossip, or telling endlessly sleepy stories about nothing. But it would have been worth any stateman's money to have heard the profound discussions that sometimes took place when a new article arrived in the Gossips of Rivertown. How solemnly they would sit and listen to the contents as drawled out by Derrick Van Bubble, the schoolmaster, a dapper, learned little man who was not to be daunted by the most gigantic word in the dictionary, and how sagely they would deliberate upon public events some months after they had taken place. The opinions of this junta were completely controlled by Nicholas Vedder, a patriarch in the village and landlord of the inn, at the door of which he took his seat from morning till night, just moving sufficiently to avoid the sun and keep in the shade of a large tree. He was rarely heard to speak, but smoked his pipe incessantly. From even the stronghold of this unlucky Rip was at length routed by his termagant wife, who would suddenly break in upon the tranquility of the assemblage and call the members out to naught. Poor Rip was at last reduced to almost despair, and his only alternative to escape from the labor of the farm and the clamor of his wife was to take a gun in hand and stroll away into the woods. In a long ramble of the kind on a fine autumnal day, Rip had unconsciously scrambled to one of the highest parts of the Catskill Mountains. He was after his favorite sport of squirrel shooting, and the still solitudes had echoed and re-echoed with the reports of his gun. Panting and fatigued, he threw himself, late in the afternoon, on a grassy knoll, covered with mountain herbage that crowned the brow From an opening between the trees, he could overlook all the lower country, from many a mile of rich woodland. He saw in a distance the lordly Hudson far, far below him, moving on his silent but majestic course, with the reflection of a purple cloud, or the sail of a lagging bark, here and there sleeping on his glassy bosom, and at last losing itself in the blue highlands. On the other side, he looked down into a deep mountain glen, wild, lonely, and shattered, the bottom filled with fragments from the impending cliffs, and scarcely lighted by the reflected rays of the setting sun. For some time, Rip lay musing on this scene. Evening was gradually advancing. The mountains began to throw their long blue shadows over the valleys. As he was about to descend, he heard a voice from a distant hallowing. He looked around, but he could see nothing but a crow winging his solitary flight across the mountain. He thought his fancy must have deceived him, and turned again to descend, when he heard the same cry ringing through the still evening air. Passing through the ravine, he came to a hollow, like a small amphitheater surrounded by perpendicular precipices, over the brinks of which impending trees shot their branches, so you could only catch glimpses of the azure parking side and the bright evening clouds. On a level spot in the center was a company of odd-looking personages playing at ninepins. They were dressed in a quaint, outlandish fashion, and they all had beards of various shapes and colors. Their visages, too, were peculiar. One had a large head, broad face, and small, pinkish eyes. The face of another seemed to consist entirely of a nose. What seemed particularly odd to Rip was that although these folks were evidently amusing themselves, yet they maintained the gravest face, the most mysterious silence, and were, withal, the most melancholy part of pleasure he had ever witnessed. Nothing interrupted the stillness of the scene but the noise of the balls, which, whenever they were rolled, echoed along the mountains like rumbling peals of thunder. And Rip and his companion approached him. They one by one desisted from their play, took a seat, and stared at him with such fixed and statue-like glaze, and such strange, uncouth, lackluster countenances, that his heart turned within him, and his knees smote together. More and more of them emerged until the amphitheater was filled, and then they began to sing. By degrees, Rip's awe and apprehension subsided. He even ventured, when no eye was fixed upon him, to taste the strange mountain beverage they were drinking. He was naturally a thirsty soul, and soon tempted to repeat the draught. Once taste provoked another, and at length his senses were overpowered. His eyes swam in his head. His head gradually declined, and he fell into a deep sleep. Visions came to him in his slumber. The first group to appear was Shawano's Circus Wonderland. Hip Hop with Becca. Nope, it wasn't yet. It was still Shauna's Circus Wonderland.
Wow.
Van Winkle thought Shonda's Circus Wonderland was a fantastic dream. And the last dream Rip Van Winkle saw was hip-hop with Becca.
Yeah, I know. Oh, how's it going?
Yeah. My cousin's a crazy, my cousin's like Boogie. Life is amazing, it is what it should be. Been here for 10, but I feel like a rookie. I tell her to look back, it's snowing and twisted. But for 3 years now, you can't even book me. It's me and Lil Baby going crazy. Weezy producing, and Weezy had made me. And she held it down, so she got it on safety. The money records, the army, the navy. It ran me 10,000, I do it like Brady. $400, like Tracy and Katie. I trust in my niggas, they never betray me.
Hip-hop with Becca dream was great, didn't you? He rubbed his eyes. It was a bright, sunny morning. The birds were hopping and twittering among the brushes, and the eagle was breasting the pure mountain breeze. He looked around for his gun, and he rose to walk. He found himself stiff in the joints. What was to be done? He shook his head, shouldered the rusty firelight, and with a heart full of trouble and anxiety, turned his steps homeward. He made shift to scramble down the mountain, working his toilsome way through the thickets of birch, sassafras, and witch hazel, and sometimes tripped up or entangled by the wide grapevines that twisted their coils or tendrils from tree to tree. He spread a kind of network in his path. He worried about Lyme's disease. As he approached the village, he met a number of people, but none whom he knew. The very village was altered. It was larger and somehow more populous. Strange names were over the doors, strange faces at the windows. Everything was strange. His mind now misgave him. He began to doubt whether he and the world around him were not bewitched. Surely this was his native village, which he had left but the day before. There stood the Catskill Mountains. There ran the silver Hudson in the distance. There was every hill and dale precisely as it had always been. Rip was sorely perplexed. That party last night, thought he, was addled. My poor head, sadly. It was with some difficulty that he found the way to his own house, which he approached with silent awe, expecting every moment to hear the shrill voice of Dame Van Winkle. He found the house gone to decay. The appearance of Rip, with his long grizzled beard, attracted the attention of the townsfolk. They crowded round him, eyeing him from head to foot with great curiosity. He cried out in despair, "Does nobody here know Rip Van Winkle? Oh, Rip Van Winkle!" exclaimed two or three. "Oh, to be sure, that's Rip Van Winkle yonder, leaning against the tree." Rip looked and beheld a precise counterpart of himself as he went up the mountain, apparently as lazy and certainly as ragged. The poor fellow was now completely confounded. He doubted his own identity, and whether he was himself or another man. In the midst of his bewilderment, the young man demanded who he was, and what was his name. "God knows!" exclaimed he at his wit's end. "I'm not myself. I'm somebody else. That's me yonder. No, that's somebody else got into my shoes. I was myself last night, but I fell asleep on the mountain, and they've changed my gun, and everything's changed, and I'm changed, and I can't tell what's my name or who I am." The bystanders began now to look each other, nod, wink significantly, and tap their fingers against their foreheads. It finally became clear. He caught his son in his arms. "I am your father," he cried. "Young Rip Van Winkle once. Oh, Rip Van Winkle now." "Sure enough, it is Rip Van Winkle. It is himself. Welcome home again. Where have you been all these years?" It was some time before he could get it into the regular track of gossip, or how could be made to comprehend the strange events that had taken place during his torpor. How that there had been a war, and something important called voting, and a dream of universal health care. He used to tell this story to every stranger that arrived at Mr. McDoodle's hotel. Some always pretended to doubt the reality of it, and insist that Rip had been out of his head, and that this was one point on which he always remained flighty. The old Dutch inhabitants, however, almost universally gave it full credit. For they well knew that the Catskill Mountains had always been haunted by strange beings. And the great Hendrik Hudson, the first discoverer of the river and the country, kept a kind of vigil there every 20 years with his crew of the Half Moon. Being permitted in this way to revisit the scenes of his enterprise and keep guardian eye upon the river and the great city called by its name. The end.